So welcome everyone. My name is Michael Akampora. I'm a research and policy advisor here at the National Network for Safe Communities, or NNSC as we call it. I'm joined by a variety of my team members who you'll meet in a few minutes. But I just wanted to introduce you to the workshop itself and why we're all here today. So this is the next installment of the GVI Workshop Series, and today's topic, or the subject of today's presentation, will be focusing on the right people, which we'll detail in a bit what that means and kind of how you go about doing so. Just a little background on us before we get started. The National Network for Safe Communities, or NNSC, is an action research center based here in New York at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice that implements proven strategic interventions. We're focusing on one of those interventions today, and as part of this workshop series, which is the group violence intervention, or GVI as you'll hear it be called, but we'll likely touch on some of our other interventions and other strategies, which are all designed to address different public safety problems, such as intimate partner violence, open-air drug markets, and prison violence. NNSC's mission is to reduce violence, build trust, and transform public safety in partnership with communities around the world. So this workshop series specifically is meant for new, interested, and or returning partners to this work. And what that means is the National Network is a network built of cities and jurisdictions around the country and around the world that we have ongoing relationships with and provide ongoing support to. But these workshops are meant for newer partners who are interested in this work but not formally working with us yet and want to learn more about our organization, our work, and this type of violence prevention. So the workshops are meant to be a space to do just that, to learn about and discuss violence prevention, focus deterrence, new innovations in the field, and other related topics. Each session, you'll hear from experienced NNSC staff members and participate in roundtable conversations where we discuss what's going on in your sites, what you heard in the presentation each time, and kind of have a back and forth conversation. The sessions are open to all, so anyone interested in exploring the GVI approach to violence reduction in their communities are welcome in these sessions. You don't have to be kind of with law enforcement or with a support and outreach organization or anything like that. Anyone is welcome. So including but not limited to, we'll just list it out: community-based organizations, social service providers, law enforcement officers and officials, municipal workers, academics, support outreach workers, any representative from any city, jurisdiction, town that's interested in exploring a new approach to violence reduction in their communities. So with all that said, we're gonna quickly do some introductions, but because there are a lot of folks here, what we're gonna do is hop into a couple of breakout rooms. Don't worry, it's not gonna be a long icebreaker activity, just 4 or 5 minutes going around saying who you are and why you're here, why you're interested in learning about GVI and our work, and then we'll rejoin in the main session for today's presentation on focusing on the right people. Happy that we're all able to make introductions, and I'm now gonna pass over to one of my colleagues, Talib Hudson, who's gonna cover a little bit about what we learned in the last session and then set up a little bit about what we're going to be learning about today and today's presentation. So over to you, Talib.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. And again, thank you, all of you for coming again today. And to the folks I was talking to in the breakout room, we got transported back in. I was just going to say this, you're in the right place. If you were here in our first session back in November, wonderful. Some of this may be repetitive information for you, and we're going to go into a deeper dive. But if you missed it on our last episode from this series, we basically talked about an overview of GVI, of the group violence intervention, what it is, and importantly, its history, its philosophy, how it came to be. One of the things that we did is we watched a short documentary. It's about 32 minutes that was done on the origins of the group violence intervention back in Boston in the 1990s. That video is available on our workshop page on our website, and I just put the link in the chat for everyone to see. So if you go to that link, you'll see the GVI Workshop Series page. You'll see the link for the retro report video. And I highly encourage everyone to, if you are interested in doing this work at all, I implore you to please go and view that video, because what you'll see is that GVI, the Group Violence Intervention, it's not a program, right? This is not something you take off the shelf and then you just have some people do it. It's really a strategy. It's a philosophy. It's a framework for bringing together various public safety partners, including law enforcement and non-law enforcement, including community members who may not be involved with any organization at all, bringing together social service providers and various community groups and organizations around a collective strategy and a collective framework to focus their resources on the very small amount of people who are responsible for most of the amount of violence that takes place in any jurisdiction. And we're going to get into that in a little bit in just a moment. Alex, if you could just switch over to the next slide. And so this is just as you can read this off the screen, and again, this information is available on our website. But again, with this being a philosophy, an approach of bringing different partners together, when this is done right, when it is done well, when it is done with fidelity, what you can experience is an enhanced legitimacy of what does legitimacy mean? Legitimacy meaning that people in the community, regular residents, will see law enforcement as more legitimate. They'll see the law as more legitimate. They'll see the service agencies as more legitimate. They'll see the outreach organizations as more legitimate, which means they'll have more, meaning that they have more credibility, that they believe in them. They say, you're really here to help me and not to harm me, right? The whole strategy and philosophy around GVI is really predicated on informal social control. There is a formal social control aspect of it, right? There is a sanction, a deterrent, an enforcement component to it. But if the strategy is relying on the formalized control, then it's not really working. And really the emphasis is on the informal part, because really what GVI should be doing when done right, we should see not only a decrease in violence, but a decrease in arrests, and decrease in incarceration, an increase in peace, and also making sure that this is all looked at from a trauma-informed lens, and recognizing that the person who is shooting today probably was shot at tomorrow and may have also incurred some other kind of trauma along the way. And that there are these circles and networks of trauma and traumatization and re-traumatization. And so that's why we say the goal of GVI is for everyone to be safe, alive, and free. And before I pass it over to my colleague, Alex, one of the things that I've been reflecting on, even just this past week, as we've been preparing for this workshop and thinking about our work overall, is it's really critically important to see everyone that's involved in this work as a fellow human being. Whether it's a fellow city agency that you're working with, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's a support and outreach organization, whether it's a community member, whether it's somebody who's involved with the group that shot somebody, right? We're not even talking about, there's no question about it. We know that they have shot somebody. Everyone is still a human being. And by bringing our humanity to this work is how the work works. And when we look at people as labels and as less than human, is when the work does not work. So that's one thing I wanted to emphasize. But what a really key part of all of this work is making sure that we're focusing on the right people, because it's only a small number of people that are really driving a larger part of the outside disproportionate part of the violence. And there's probably no one better that I can think of to really get into this than my colleague, Alex Acevedo. And I'll just speak on him. He's a data analyst here at NNSC, but he's so much more to us. He is a scholar and a gentleman, someone who has done a number of different problem analyses. And he'll get into, if you don't know what a problem analysis is, we'll explain that. But he has looked at the numbers and the data from, I don't even know how many dozens, if not more, cities, and has been able to see, looking specifically at specific incidents, right? Specific incidents, city by city by city by city, who are the people that are responsible or connected to the greatest amount of violence. Again, across cities, big city, small city, everyone says my city is different. Okay, but across a whole range, you start to see similar patterns. So with that, let me not take any more time and pass it over to my colleague, Alexis Acevedo.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the great introduction. If at any point it's difficult to hear me or anything, please let me know. I know that there are always some internet issues during these type of meetings. And if there are any pressing questions, I know that we're planning to answer questions at the end, but if there's anything pressing that you all want to bring up, please feel free. The same goes to my colleagues. If there's a point that you think we need to expand on, please feel free to jump in. So I think it's important to remember that, or like the fundamental reason why GVI operates and why it works is because it operates on the central idea that communities are not inherently dangerous, right? But instead that violence is driven by a small number of people, right? So in other words, violence is concentrated in a small segment of a city's overall population, right? In communities that are experiencing violence, very few people are actually involved in violence, right? Over the years of working with cities implementing GVI, we have found that this fact to be true in nearly all of the cities that we've worked in. And this fact is that groups that represent less than 1% of a city's population are involved in about 50% of that city's serious violence, right? And in this case, serious violence refers to homicides and non-fatal shootings. We're well aware that violence and serious violence can be expanded to other crimes, but I think it's important to remember that the central goal of the group violence intervention is to reduce homicides and non-fatal shootings, right? So this is how concentration can be represented visually, right? So this graphic presents the concentration of homicides from 16 different cities that we've worked in the past. On the left are the population figures, and on the right are the violence figures, right? In this case, homicide. So how we would interpret this figure is that on average, groups that represent 0.57% of those 16 cities overall population are involved in at least 48% of homicides in those cities over a given period of time, right? This is also true when we did this analysis for non-fatal shootings, right? So we find that this pattern tends to repeat across sites, and that I think fundamentally that suggests that this is a fundamental fact about group violence, right? That when you look at a city that is experiencing group violence, gang-related violence, you find that the people that are involved in this violence are actually very few, right? And I think that has really important implications for what we do about that, right? First, it tells us that we need to focus on this group of high-risk people, right? That these are individuals who can be both victims of violence, but also drive that violence themselves, right? So in other words, the boundaries between being a victim and a victimizer become incredibly blurry, right? Instead, we can characterize this violence as cyclical, where one day someone gets shot, the next day they might shoot in retaliation, right? That highlights the need to break up and to intervene into these cycles of violence, right? This also gives us a better perspective about violence, right? Again, serious violence is driven by a small number of people. Then it makes sense to focus on this high-risk population, right? It also means that, if implemented correctly, right, Talib mentioned with fidelity, then we have the ability to reduce a significant amount of violence in a city, right? If we understand that the small number of people are involved in, maybe half of the city's overall violence. Well, focusing our resources on this small number of people, we have the ability, right, theoretically, to be able to reduce, up to half of a city's violence rate, which I think is really important, right? Because again, the central goal of GVI is to keep folks safe, alive, and free, right? So it's a lot harder to potentially deter violence from the broader 99% of the population than it is to deter that less than 1% of a city's population. And I think fundamentally it makes the problem more manageable by operating under this kind of paradigm, right? It also combats the idea that neighborhoods themselves are dangerous, right? Which we know have had several, negative consequences of that type of thinking and of that type of enforcement. So this ultimately changes how we address violence, right? Again, going back to the point that Talib mentioned about this being an approach and not a program, right? And this extends not only to the criminal justice responses, but also within the larger framework of public safety, right? We recognize that public safety is not just or should not just be the lone enterprise of criminal justice agencies, right? It is public safety is something that should be expanded to other sectors of the community, right? But that doesn't take away from the fact that this is the high risk population that we need to focus on with these other resources, right, outside of just the criminal justice agencies. So the next logical question is, well, how do we get to this point, right? How do we identify those who are at the highest risk, right? So at this point, I will introduce what we call the problem analysis. And what is the problem analysis, right? What we call a problem analysis is not too dissimilar from the traditional form of problem analysis that identifies and analyzes problems, right? In other endeavors, problem analysis tends to be the same thing, right? It's looking at a problem and trying to figure out, what is the best solution to that problem, right? The way we define it is that it is a set of action research exercises with knowledgeable frontline practitioners that produce a picture of local group violence dynamics, right? In this case, we are specifically referring to group violence, but this can be expanded to other areas and other type of behaviors that are of concern for cities, right? So it is a process. It is also a process of establishing a shared understanding of what violence looks like in a city, right? Through this process, we are creating new facts on the ground with partners, partner cities. Why do we even need a problem analysis? I think this is a perfectly appropriate question to have. To start with, it is very hard to combine existing data to provide a clear picture of violence dynamics, right? The type of information that we look for is usually scattered among individuals, among different agencies, among different databases, right? So putting that data together is usually very hard. And we also understand that homicide investigations are usually about individual cases, right? They're usually about clearing cases, and they're really not focused on these larger patterns that we're looking to analyze, right? We also realize that non-fatal shootings do not typically receive the same level of attention as homicides, right? For a variety of reasons. So there's typically less information available about these type of incidents in official data sources. It is also true that, in our experience, formal gang definitions tend to obscure group dynamics, and we'll get into why that is later in this presentation. And finally, we also know that existing data sources are often limited in the amount of information that is available in them, right? Since they usually have very specific purposes, you're not going to be able to find all of the information that we're usually looking for in official data sources. So, to account for some of these issues, we look to develop information directly with our partners through, these set of exercises. What we have found, in working with cities is that frontline law enforcement usually has the most accessible knowledge about violence groups and street dynamics, but I'll make a point about that next. This is primarily due to their proximity to the problem, right? Those closest to the problem tend to know the most about the problem. This of course depends on the size and structure of each police department, right? For larger departments, information tends to be more scattered, harder to get to, right? There tend to be silos that make sharing information in larger departments more difficult. So the problem analysis in GVI broadly, relies on a street level information, right? Those officers who are actually, who actually have relationships with people who are involved in violence, right? Um, this is this is not only true for law enforcement, but it's also true for community organizations and those working with individuals involved in violence, right? So I think for a long time, the knowledge of community members and organizations who are doing support and outreach in the streets has for a long time their knowledge has been ignored, which I think has probably led to some of the negative consequences of law enforcement in addressing group violence. So I think it's important to remember that it's not only law enforcement's knowledge that is crucial here. It's also important to take into account the knowledge of the community itself about violence, in their community. And I think the implications of those two type of knowledges should be separated, right? They fulfill different roles, which I think we'll discuss it in future sessions, of course. So at this point, I think it's important to clarify why we prefer to use the term groups instead of gangs, right? We use the term groups because groups they don't need to fit the statutory definition of a gang or have a specific name or identifying symbol to be considered a group, right? In other words, all gangs are groups, but not all groups are gangs, right? GVI takes into account all groups, not just gangs. By taking into account all groups and not just gangs, we can get a better picture of violence dynamics in a city and have a greater impact on violence, right? And I'll just share a quick example of why this matters. We hear a lot during the problem analysis, in a lot of cities that we work in, that there are no real gangs in their city, right? At least in the traditional gangland sense, right? There are no national gangs, right? There is no real gang problem in these cities. Instead, law enforcement describes these as loose groups, loose sets with individuals who may have a connection to, some of these more traditional gangs, but also have kind of like a shared loyalty to where they grew up, in, to their neighborhoods. In other words, they're describing what we call these hybrid groups, hybrid gangs, right? Now, if we operated by only focusing on gangs in the traditional sense, then I think there's a real possibility that we would miss the opportunity to have an impact on violence that these hybrid groups are involved in, right? I think we would miss the opportunity to address a lot of violence that might not be committed by these traditional gangs the way they have been thought of and operate in, I guess, larger cities presently. I also think that hybrid groups are probably starting to become the norm and not the exception in many of the places that we work in, right? It feels like there's definitely been a shift from, the traditional gangs with clear identified structures and, bylaws that they operate in to, people who just hang out and do stuff together. And sometimes that stuff ends up in violence, right? I think that's starting to become the norm, at least based on our experience in working with cities across the country. So I've talked a lot about the problem analysis without mentioning some of its components, right? Like what exactly is it, right? So there are two components of the problem analysis. The first part is what we call the group audit, right? The purpose of the group audit is to identify all groups contributing to violence in the city, right? For each of these groups, we want to know primarily, the number of individuals in the group, their age ranges, the activities they're involved in, right? Some groups might be, selling drugs, but some groups might actually make money from that, whereas others are just doing it to fulfill, a small purpose of their, overall need, right? We also want to know the key individuals within the group who are driving the violence, right? So oftentimes in cities that we work in, we hear that, this group has over 100 members. And I think sometimes we have to take a step back and really evaluate what that means, right? Are these hundreds of people actually involved in violence on a day-to-day basis, or is it more like out of those hundreds, probably like 20 guys who are actually really pushing the violence and kind of dominating what these other guys do, or right? So I think the figuring out who are key individuals within a group is important, right? Because these key individuals are probably the ones who can affect the behavior of the group, right? In some cases, not all cases, right? It depends how organized the group is and whatnot. But I just wanted to make that point clear. And then we also want to know if there are any active alliances or rivalries that these groups have, right? Like if there's ongoing back and forth between groups, well, why is it happening, and who is the other group that groups are shooting, beefing with right now? And then, who are they on good terms with right now? I think that's all important to know. And with the group audit, I think once you do the group audit, things can change very rapidly, right? Who people hang out with, who they're cool with, on one week can change the next week, and we understand that. So I think we'll get into why it's important to continually refresh this information, keep it as current as possible. The second component of the problem analysis is the incident review, or the shooting review. And the purpose of the incident review, is to determine the proportion of incidents that can be attributed to groups, right? We want to know, we want to know the number of homicides and non-fatal shootings that groups are involved in over a period of time, right? And to do so, we talk about each incident individually, right? We talk about each homicide and non-fatal shooting over a period of time. And for each incident, we mostly focus on these questions, right? We want to know what happened, right? Why did the incident occur in the first place? We also want to know if the individuals involved are known to law enforcement, but also if they're, a part of a group, right? Do they hang out with other folks? Who are these groups that they're involved in? And finally, we also want to know, if the incident is tied to other incidents, right? We want to know if it's part of a larger back and forth, and if it is part of a larger back and forth, we want to know, well, how did that chain of violence start, right? We want to know that, so I think the main takeaway from the incident review is, we want to know how many incidents groups are involved in, right? Because I think that's an important implication for a city to know, right? To even determine if GVI is the appropriate approach for them, right? Because if a city can't point to a significant amount of group violence within their territory, then I think other approaches might be more appropriate, right? I'm going to show you next is a sample of the incident review. So what we do is we have a PowerPoint slide for every homicide and non-fatal shooting that we review with the city, right? On this PowerPoint slide, we have the names of victims and any suspects involved in the incident. We have some demographic information about the victims and suspects, and then we also have like a short narrative of what law enforcement believes happened during the incident. And we usually collect a lot of information during this exercise, excuse me, but the most important thing I think that we collect in the incident review is whether the incident is can be attributed to a group or not, right? And then, you know, if it can be attributed to a group, you know, which group, right? Because I think it's really important to be able to attribute incidents to specific groups, and doing that with fidelity, right? Being sure that it is the case that this group was actually involved in this incident, right? Because I think again, going back to transparency and making sure we're doing the right thing here. But yeah, and during the incident review, we collect a lot of information, but the most important information that we want to get to is one, is the incident, does the incident involve the group members, and two, if it does, you know, who are these group members? So I can get into more detail, but I don't think it's necessary to talk about the spreadsheets in more detail. So I'm gonna go back to the presentation. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so can everyone see the presentation now? Excellent, thank you.
Yes.
Great. So I mentioned group member involvement, group involvement. Well, what does that mean, right? What does what we call group member involvement, GMI, the variable, what does it mean, right? We consider incidents as GMI or group member involved if, you know, if the suspect is in the incident is a member of a group, if the victim is a member of a group, or if both of them are a member of a group. Those incidents would be classified as group member involved, right? There's also a second set of incidents where, you know, the context of the incidents, you know, indicate that either the victim or a suspect are in a group, but this can't be confirmed by law enforcement, right? We usually consider these incidents as likely GMI or likely group involved, right? Because if, you know, if we can't be certain that this incident, you know, that it involves a member of a group, then, you know, we should be as conservative as possible in classifying these incidents, right? I want to make an important distinction between, you know, group member motivated, gang motivated, and group member involved here, right? Traditionally, gang motivated incidents have been those that are considered to stem from gang activity, right? Those that in some way advance their interests, right? So, you know, disputes over territory, disputes over drugs, right, between gangs, those would, in the traditional sense, are considered or have been considered gang motivated incidents, right? Group member involvement takes these incidents into account, but it also takes other incidents that would not fall within that category of incidents into account, right? For example, you know, a domestic or intimate partner related incident involving a group member, you know, would not be considered gang motivated, group motivated, right? But it does fall under group member involvement. So I think it's important to make that that comparison, right? If we want to address, if we want to have the ability to reduce the incidents that people are involved in, then we should look at all the incidents that they're involved in, right? And build that into, you know, a strategy, right? Because, you know, there's a I think as we've started to see across sites, there's a clear overlap between being part of a group and doing other things such as being involved in domestic incidents and intimate partner violence, right? So where there is overlap, I think it's important to take note of that. So I just want to make that point. And so let's quickly walk through how we code GMI incidents, right? So first, Again, we talk about the incident. We want to know what happened. We want to know who's involved. When we talk about the incident, if the individuals are unknown, right? If they're not known to law enforcement, then we would consider this as GMI unknown, right? Because we can't say whether or not this is a GMI, a group member involved incident or not. If law enforcement does know them, but they don't know if they're in a group or not, well, then this incident should also be considered as unknown, right? Because we can't say whether they're involved in a group or not. However, if when we review this incident, where we see that there's a chance that they're in a group, right? It's not, law enforcement can't confirm it, but the most likely indication is that they are in a group, but we just can't confirm that. Then we'll consider this as a likely GMI, right? Because again, we're being more conservative here, right? If we can't confirm it, then we should not consider it as a GMI incident, right? As an incident that is that involves a group, right? However, if we talk about the incident and law enforcement is able to say, law enforcement and participants, because there are other participants, is able to say that yes, this individual was in a group, then we would classify these incidents as GMI, right? They are confirmed, so that's how we would code them. However, there's a separate set of an additional criteria, if you will, that we look at, and that's when we talk about the incident and the victim and the suspect are not involved in a group, right? Well, then we would ask, is the context of the incident group involved? And I'll give you an example of that. Sometimes in cities that we work in, there are a lot of unintended victims that get shot. Perhaps it's a drive-by. The victim is not in a group, right? They're unintended. They weren't part of any back and forth. We don't know who the suspects are, right? The suspects are unknown. Happens a lot. But the location. Perhaps they were shooting at a rival's house, right? We know that house. There's a group member who lives in that house, right? But they didn't get shot, right? This unintended victim gets shot. Well, then that opens up this possibility to the context of the incident, suggesting that there is group involvement, right? And if the context suggests that there is no group involvement, well, then we would classify this incident as non-GMI, as not relating to groups. If it does, again with the example of the drive-by that I suggested, then we would consider this incident as group member involved. And there are also instances where it's not very clear, right? Where we can't make that determination. These incidents would be considered as likely GMI. And I know that the diagram is, well, it may be straightforward, but it's also very difficult to do this in practice, right? There's a lot of instances where we're unsure of how to classify these incidents, and I think the more information and the better we do the problem analysis exercises, the better informed participants come to these sessions, the better the analysis is, right? Because the analysis is only as good as the information that we collect during the problem analysis process, right? So to recap, what happens after we collect all of this information? Well, we produce a report with findings. The analysis is very straightforward. It's descriptive in nature. I think for the purposes of this, I don't think the analysis has to be terribly sophisticated, because it points at really fundamental things, right? Again, the City of Columbus made their report public, so we can share that report afterward, so you all can get familiar with what the problem analysis report and what the findings look like. And secondly, these results generated during the problem analysis act as a baseline with which to compare future violence, right? So they act as a starting point for the intervention, right? The results also act as a common ground, right? A common understanding for all those involved in public safety in a city, right? Oftentimes it's very hard to get different people to agree on kind of like a starting point, right? And these facts these are facts that hopefully everyone can agree with because they're, usually they're created with everyone's involvement, right? So, um, the hope is that there is some shared understanding and some common ground before the start of an intervention. And then finally, these results act as a reminder that the purpose of GVI is to focus on, the highest risk individuals, right? Those who are getting shot, but also those who are doing the shooting, right? The main goal is to keep high risk individuals safe, alive, and free. And I think that's an important line that we should remember. Um, Again, as my colleague Talib mentioned, it's important to humanize and to remember that, at the end of the day, we don't want people getting shot. We don't want people in prison, right? We want people to be free and to live the best life that they can, right? So that's all for me. I'm going to turn it over to Michael at this point. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was amazing as usual. So we wanted to use this time first to address any questions that folks had during the presentation about any facets of the presentation, the examples, the chart, anything. While we have Alex here, kind of pick his brain a little bit more about this problem analysis process, the group audits, focusing on the right people, the incident reviews, anything like that. So if folks want to just raise their hand and ask questions, we'll be happy to start fielding those.
And Michael, just to specify, do you mean the raise hand feature on Zoom, which is people can find in their reactions button at the bottom of the screen?
Correct,
like
correct. So, yeah, just right down to the right of your Zoom, to the left of end. Yeah, just raise your hand on there. We'll start picking names. If folks want to throw questions in the chat too, that works. However you want to ask, we're happy to field the questions.
Well, while folks are formulating their questions, there was something that came up, and I won't say who said it or put them on, but a question that came up in our breakout room, and a question that comes up just in general is, it's interesting. Alex's chart, when we saw the kind of the ages of some of the folks who were involved in incidents, and a question that was raised earlier today was about folks who are juveniles. Although the juveniles wasn't defined, so I'm assuming they meant under 18. I don't know if they mean 13 to 18 or what, but that question comes up, like, are those the right people? So I don't know if Alex, if you have anything to speak to that, or anyone in our team, if they have anything to speak to that question of juveniles, right people.
I think so one of the common things that we hear when we're doing this analysis in different cities is that, it's the juveniles, right? It's the really young people who are doing the shooting. They're the ones who are who are involved in this stuff. And I think what we usually find is that, in most cities, it's not really juveniles who are doing the shooting and who are getting shot, right? In most cases, it's people between 18 and 24 who are doing shooting. In some cases, it's a little older. But I can't give you like an average, but when we do this incidents, juveniles make up maybe less than 10% of victims and suspects, right? I think it's important. That has important implications, right? It means that the strategy should focus on those who are actually involved, right? But I think if a juvenile is involved, I think maybe the approach changes a little bit, right? Recognizing the fact that they are, in this case, we're assuming that they would be under 18, right? I think the strategy and what we do about that, how we address that, maybe should be different, right? I'm not an expert, but that's what I think would happen. I'm curious to see what others on the session think when it comes to that. But broadly, it turns out to be that juveniles are not mostly involved in these incidents, though there obviously are. It tends to be young adults who are doing the shooting and getting shot at, right?
Isaac, I see your hand is raised.
Thank you, y'all. This is a good presentation. And speaking on the juvenile issues, that we've been doing this work with GVI for going on 11 years, now 10 years, 11 years. We've seen there's a significant change in our community as far as gun violence when it comes to juveniles. When we started, it was 18 to 25, 28, and now we had one of our shooters and it was a 13-year-old. And it's more youth being involved in the shootings now than ever before. We are fighting now, trying to grasp around how do we deal with this juvenile issue. And if anybody got their hands on it, we would like to be able to talk to you to see how you can help us deal with it. We're working with our Juvenile Justice Center. We're working with the social workers in the community. We're working with the schools to try to get ahead of it, to try to prevent it. But there's no rhyme or reason to what's going on. When we first started, it was actual gangs in our city. Now we have fractions. So we're trying to keep up with the fractions. One day they're Ohio Street, next day they're Brookfield, and they still in the same gang. So it's just trying to keep up that tracks of who's who, who's doing the shooting. How do we identify the individuals? Try to do preventative maintenance before it happens, but also if we're saying that this is the first or the worst, that we follow through on the strategy as well. So I hope somebody got some answers on this juvenile questions because we can really, really use it. Thank you.
Sure. Morgan?
Yeah, I just want to expand on some of what Alex was saying earlier. Even when a lot of times when we are seeing juveniles involved directly in violence, it still is the legal adults behind them that are actually driving the violence. So maybe they're having the 16-year-old go out and actually shoot the person, but there's good chance they're being told to do that by a 20-year-old. So it still allows us to focus more on the adults, which obviously that's a bit easier to do.
Thank you. And I realized we didn't all do introductions earlier, so just for those who don't know, Morgan is on our team here at NNSC. So she's currently advising sites around the country and has a lot of experience doing the exact sort of work that Alex just described. Does anyone else have questions about the presentation proper? Or Talib?
Oh, I just wanted to add just to the point about, since you're talking about focusing on the right people, is, letting the data inform the decision making. And so it could be the case, for example, that looking at that's why we do the problem analysis, looking at specific incidents. It could be that a lot of shootings are people are involving 18 to 24-year-olds. It could be that they're 16 to 18. It could be that they're 13 to 16. It could have been 13 to 16 in June and July, and in December it was 18 to 24. But whatever it is, letting the data, and I think drive that decision. And I think that's one of the key takeaways. I think from this particular session when we're talking about focusing on the right people. I used to work before working at NNSC. I used to work in city government. I used to work in a prosecutor's office. And having worked in a prosecutor's office, or in the prosecutor's an elected office, I know that sometimes there can be pressures for responses to cases that are high profile, right? So, for example, a 10-year-old gets shot, and that is horrendous. But then people say, well, we have to focus all these things on the 10-year-old. And although that 10-year-old getting shot may have, as horrendous as it is, we don't want it to obscure the fact that, 99 out of the 100 shootings are involving, other folks, or the person who pulled the trigger in one case. For example, we've seen in the news, there's a horrible case of a 6-year-old shot their teacher, right? Which is a horrendous, horrible incident, right? And although that story has made national news, I don't think anyone would say, well, and so then therefore we should focus all our resources on 6-year-olds to make sure they're not shooting, when, the profile of people who may be shooting might be a bit different. But so my point is that it may vary. And so the important thing is not to focus necessarily on what is maybe driving political pressures of the time, but what are the incidents actually telling, right? If you actually look at the incidences that are actually occurring, whatever in your specific jurisdiction over time, because like Isaac said, 2 years ago, it might have been 18 to 24, and now it might be 13 to 18, right? And so that's one of the reasons why we talk about this problem analysis. We make sure that this process is it's iterative. So it's not like you do a problem analysis and you look at who the high-risk people are in 2015, and then you keep that same list of people in perpetuity. No, that's not going to help. You really want to keep looking at what the data is telling you about how to focus your resources. And I'll go back on mute, and I see Ken has his hand up.
Yeah, Ken?
Yeah, I'm the elected prosecutor from Isaac's jurisdiction. So I agree with you that we got to look at the analysis and not the political pressures. But I can tell you we had 25 homicides in South Bend last year. 5 of them were committed by folks that I had to waive from juvenile court to adult court. So this is not a random thing. We've had a shift in our paradigm of who those individuals are. I agree with you 100%. I ought not to be looking at the information from 4 years ago. It should be looking at the information of today. Who is the worst or the first? And unfortunately, right now, we've got our worst and first are folks who are under the age of 18. And so Isaac's request of help, it wasn't just from him, it was from our whole jurisdiction. And over, because I can talk too much, so I'll stop talking.
Just to go back to leave the point you were making about the importance of staying on top of this data and kind of who's actually out there committing this violence. Alex and Talib and Morgan, can you weigh in on why it's important to regularly refresh the group audit and to regularly conduct incident reviews, and kind of how often you're meant to be doing this and why, and just talk about that a bit?
Sure. Well, to Ken's point, just really quickly, I think this is a concern. The question about juveniles is not just specific to your city. I think there are a couple other places that have also raised similar concerns about juveniles. I definitely think it's if that's the trend, then we should brainstorm on like how do we address that trend, and like why has that trend shifted, right? I know that, so I just want to make that point that we've heard it from other cities. So I think there's something definitely to look at there. And in terms of refreshing these exercises, I think the point of doing the problem analysis, at least for the incident review, is to have a city do this on a regular basis, right? Have them review incidents with the stakeholders who need to be there on a regular basis, so that they're on top of these trends, right? Just as Ken mentioned, right? Like these shootings involve 5 of 25, 5 involving youth. Well, then this would come up during the incident review, right, that cities are doing on a regular basis. And I think in regard to the group audit, I think again, someone mentioned this, but that alliances, affiliations change really quickly. So once you do the group audit, next week all this information might not be any good, right? Might be old, might not be useful. So I think that staying on top of this is important, right? Because I think it also has an implication of how you address this, and like what you can point to when somebody asks you, why are you taking these measures? Well, you can point to the work that you all have done, and saying like, this is the patterns that we're seeing, this is how things are changing, and this is how we're responding to these changes, right? So I think ultimately it's very important to stay on top of these changes. And it's only this data that is collected is only part of the picture, right? I think the other part of the picture is actually doing the work within work groups, right? Having these discussions, staying on top of things, right? That's the other half of of the problem, right? The data will only tell you so much, but like how you work through, how you deal with the data, how this data is impacted by the relationships within the work groups, I think is the other important half of like how you stay on top of things, right? So I don't know, Talib, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I'll also connect it to a question in the chat, and I see that Isabel's responding in the chat as well. There's a set of principles that guides the work from NNSC's perspective, which we also have on our website. And the first one of those principles is to do no harm. And it's thinking about how do we best use our resources in support of the community and of people. Remember, again, earlier I said, making sure that we're looking at everyone as a person, as a human being. And one of the critiques of this work of GVI, and let's just be real about it, right? People say, oh, you have gang lists. You're keeping a list of gang databases. And our response to that is, if this work is being done right, there should be no gang list. There should be no gang database. Because if someone has someone's name on a list from 6 months ago, right? If Johnny, right, might have been in the crew, an ABC crew in February, and in September, Johnny is doing something different, then don't hold Johnny accountable for who Johnny used to be if that's not what Johnny's doing today, right? Like you gotta be able to shift and be able to be and keep everything fresh. So I've heard, everyone's got different amount of resources what they can do. So if you can do it, you can refresh your group audit every quarter, right? Do it every quarter. That's every 6 months. Make it every, right? Like, listen, you can refresh it even sooner than that. Then refresh it even sooner than that. The thing is not to keep static information and static lists. And also to the other point, to the point of regarding also with juveniles and the question about customs as well. It's not always what you do; it's how you do it. And again, this is why we want to say this is an approach. It's a philosophy, right? It's not like, okay, so we have someone we believe to be in a group and we're going to do a custom, and we do a custom just like this. And doesn't matter what the particulars of the situation is, this is how we will do the custom, and we will do it in a robotic fashion. It's like, no, the thing is to be sensitive and to be it's a custom because it should be customized. It should be a custom notification. So there are some people who may be released on parole. There may be people who may be disabled. There may be people who have children. There may be people who are born into a gang intergenerationally. And you can't just say, leave the gang. Like, that doesn't even make sense, right? The notification should be customized to whoever that person is and whatever what their situation is, including whatever particular sanction, right? You're not going to go to somebody who is 13 and say, we're going to lock you up. If you know for a fact, legally speaking, you have no ability to do that. It doesn't even make it. It's a false promise. It's not going to work, right? On the same time, if someone is on parole, if they're already under community supervision, right? You know that they're already dealing with a different set of pressures and a different set of structures and guidelines that, maybe you can work in partnership with parole or with the state or with others. Also, the same thing should be there for the support and the outreach side of it, right? If someone, for example, has children, or even going back to someone being on parole or someone being 13, you're not going to offer the same support and outreach or the same sanctions for someone who's 13 to someone who's 25, someone who's on parole and someone who's not on parole. So you really so it's not always just what you do, but it's how you do it. And again, moving in the spirit of the philosophy of what GVI is, and not just saying we did the thing because that's what we do. We do the thing. It's always not just what you do, but how you do it.
Thank you, Talib. That was well put. And I also wanted to queue up our next session, which I'll formally introduce in a few minutes, will be about direct communication, specifically including customs. So we're going to do a deep dive into customs in our next session in a couple of months. So we'll be answering all those questions and having a full kind of cohesive presentation on customs and things that could go wrong, and kind of tailoring them directly for the person who's meant to receive them, along with other ways that you could conduct this kind of direct communication to the folks at highest risk that we've been discussing today. But to another one of your points, to leave, that I wanted to ask you and Alex about is the spirit of GVI and NNSC is do no harm. And I know that when we were conducting these problem analyses and these group audits and these incident reviews, if they're not conducted with this kind of fidelity that you mentioned earlier, things can go wrong and kind of cause unintentional harm that we weren't planning when we were trying to roll out this intervention. So can you speak to a bit about the ways that you've seen incident reviews and group audits kind of not be performed with that level of fidelity, and kind of easy ways in which they could go wrong, and how to kind of avoid against that?
I can start. I think problem analysis generally go wrong when participants, when we don't have the right mix of participants, right? So what does that mean? It means when we have participants who are not familiar with these incidents, right? Who don't know the people involved in these incidents, right? When you have folks who aren't familiar with the information that we're looking for, ultimately these exercises and end up being very painful, because nobody gets anything good out of them, right? We don't learn anything about a site, and the site, ultimately isn't provided with anything very useful, right? So I think the most important thing for a successful problem analysis is to have the right mix of people who know the high risk population, right? Who know these incidents intimately, right? Who can tell us, off the cuff why this incident happened, what happened, right? And I think another point is, after the problem analysis, right? After the report goes out to the sites, I think what can go wrong there is when stakeholders aren't on the same page, right? I think ultimately that's how GVI breaks down, right? Like that's how it doesn't work, when folks aren't on the same page, when they're not working toward the same goal, right? When maybe the DA's office is all on board, but maybe the police department isn't, right? That ultimately is very difficult to work through, right? So, the cooperation between agencies, I think, is, to me, the fundamental thing of whether, a strategy and approach like this works or not, right? And then, after a while, you do want this to be part of how city does public safety, right? How, again, not a program, but an approach, right? A philosophy. But yeah, I think that's what I have for that.
And just to dig a little deeper, I might go a little, I might push the envelope a little bit more. Alex was very polite. And thank you for that, Alex. I'll tell you a couple of things where it goes wrong. One is when we talk about law enforcement being the source of information, because law enforcement, as a entity of the state, right, of the government, right, in a democratically elected society, right, have the investigatory power to go find out information, right? They can go to a crime, they can go to a shooting and literally go and collect information and have access to information. They can do ballistics reports, and they have access to surveillance information that that non-sworn citizens, that outreach regulators, whoever may not have. They just, legally speaking, they have access to information that other folks just don't have, right? And so that is why they can be a key source, or the key source, when we're doing this problem analysis. So now, that being said, oftentimes that there can be an ossification, a calcification, a hardening into this is the way we do things. And I've seen people rely on, not to beat up on the idea of group lists, like gang databases, but I gotta say what it is, right? Like I've seen folks, you try to go through a problem analysis, and you're saying, okay, well, who's do you believe to be in the ABC crew? Oh, we know John and Joe and Jack. Oh, really? Yeah, they're in our database. And it's like, I didn't ask you who was in the database. I asked you, like, who was involved in the shooting last week? Was John Joe and Jack involved in shootings last week? Oh no, they ain't been involved in nothing since last year. Well, then why are you worrying about John Joe and Jack? Let them live their lives. You know what I mean? Who was involved? Somebody got shot last week. Who are those people, right? So I think it goes left when people rely on kind of which is kind of already there, right? And listen, everyone's busy, and I get it. Like, and this work is hard, right? Talking about people getting shot is hard. Talking about young people getting shot is hard. Going after counties is hard. I make no illusions about that. But if you really want to do the work well, it's really got to keep it fresh and not just rely on what's been done. To that point, having the right people in the room. I'm gonna keep it real with y'all. That's what y'all came for. Even within law enforcement structures, for whatever internal politics, sometimes you'll say, where's a group audit? And you'll have this chief and this person and that person, and they don't know anything. It's no disrespect. There's no disrespect. They just don't know. But the patrol officer who's like lower ranking, who just got out of the academy 6 months ago, but knows everybody on the block, that patrol officer might know who's who and what's what, right? That's the right person to be in the room. The person who is the officer who's working, working a certain beat or working a certain area, who knows things and's got relationships. That's the officer that you want in the room. They'll be the people who may know. Oh, okay, we actually know that it was David and Dante and whoever that were involved in this, or were not involved in this, or yes, they rep the gang, but they're not in the gang, right? And those are very important distinctions. We're focusing on the right people. That's very important distinctions about why you need the right people. When we're talking about the right people, it's not just who's in the crews, it's who's in the room saying who's in the crews. And so where these audits and these prominences can go left is we say, oh, well, we see on social media that John is in the gang. But, maybe the gang unit detective knows John's not really in the gang. John walks around with the shirt or whatever like that, but John not pulling the trigger, right? And so it's really important to get that level of detail. And then just to the point that Alex's point about agencies working together, this work doesn't work if people don't make it work. If you look in the video, the Retro Report documentary, there's a line in there, and spoiler alert, but one of the people in the documentary says, the Boston miracle wasn't that the violence dropped by 63% in youth homicides. The Boston miracle was that the adults came together for the sake of the children. And oftentimes in this work, we see people in various, we got prosecutors over here, and the police is over here, and parole probation is over there, and then you got like the if it's maybe a support and outreach team or whoever, like they're over here, and whoever the different, sometimes you have police and a sheriff's office, right? However it breaks down in your particular jurisdiction, right? And where people become very territorial and they don't want to share information. And so if you're operating off bad information, if you're operating off bad intel, then you're not going to be focusing on the right people. And if you're not focusing on the right people, then this work is not going to work. And I just want to add this one last thing, and I'll be quiet because I'm on my soapbox and I'll shut up, is that when we're talking about focusing on the right people, we're not just talking about arrest and prosecution. When we came and if there's one thing I hope you leave with many things, but if there's one thing I want you to leave from this session is when we're talking about focusing on the right people, it's not just who do we go and we lock up, because that's not what this is about. If all we're doing is locking up people, then we're doing it wrong. It's who are the right people that we can target either with swift, certain, and fair sanctions, or swift, certain, and sufficient supports, right? And so depending on it's very context and situationally based. So focusing on the right people, both not just who's out on the street, but also who's in the room, is very important. And then situationally having the right tools to use in order to address each specific situation. So I'll stop talking.
Thank you, Talib and Alex, for both giving excellent, thorough responses to my questions and participating so gamely. Does anyone else have questions before we wrap up for today? I just have a couple bits of housekeeping and information about the next session that I'm going to queue up. All right. All right. Can everyone see that? Great. So again, thank you for joining us today. Our next session will be about direct communication, like we were mentioning earlier, and they'll take place on Thursday, March 2nd. So that's going to be a deep dive into direct communication and how to engage with those individuals at highest risk. So learn about focusing on the right people and then how do we engage with those people. So learning about the different mechanisms to do so, custom notifications that we were just discussing a bit, call-ins, and CPRVVs, which are community and police responses to victims of violence. So learning about all the different ways in which direct communication plays a role in this strategy. And then future sessions will include deep dives into all the other facets of GVI, some or most of which we touched on today, including support and outreach, community moral voices, police legitimacy, and managing resources and partnerships. So if you want to reach out to our team at GVI Workshop at NNScommunities.org, you could sign up for future workshops, make sure you're on the mailing list for future info and any follow-up materials that we'll send out. And you could pass that email along to any of your colleagues who wish to join, anyone who you think would gain something from participating in these sessions. We're happy to include them, so just send that email along and have them email us. And you could go to our website, nnscommunities.org/GVI Workshop, where we'll have all the material from today's session. So we'll have the recording, the presentation, the report Alex spoke about, and anything else that we think is relevant or helpful from today's material, along with the materials from each other session. So from last month's session on GVI overview, we have the recording and the slides and materials there, and we'll be updating it as we go with each future session's materials. So feel free to give that a look, but we'll also send out the materials, the slides, to everyone who participated today, whose email addresses we already have, but just in case, you could head to our website as well. Thank you again for joining us. Again, feel free to share the email and any information about this with your colleagues, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session.
Thank you.
Sure. And feel free to reach out with any questions at all to that email address. So we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you again. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.